In 1642, the people of England were forced to choose between loyalty to Parliament or their king. So-called Roundheads and Cavaliers were answering the call to arms, most for the first time in their lives. Civil war had begun. The question was, how to win it?
Both sides knew that cavalry could be decisive in this conflict, but with no professional army to call on, it was up to commanders to mould untrained volunteers into a battle-winning force.
Draw sword! Front march!
In the opening year of the war, one side was pulling ahead. The royalist horse under the experienced soldier Prince Rupert, King Charles's nephew, was proving unstoppable, sweeping aside their parliamentary opponents in almost every engagement. If Parliament's cause was going to survive, not to mention the soldiers who fought for it, they'd need a leader who could learn from these costly mistakes. In this episode, I've joined up with the Worcestershire Cavalry to find out what it was really like to serve in the saddle during the mid-17th century. Using contemporary accounts and a little first-hand experience, we'll find out just how hard it was to whip raw recruits into shape and turn them into professional troopers. With help from the Marquess of Winchester's Regiment, part of the English Civil War Society, we'll also discover what threats cavalrymen faced on the battlefield.
That's a nasty array of spikes, isn't it?
How they fought back, and just how likely it was that you'd make it out alive. Long-standing arguments over religion, taxation, and the limits of royal power led to the outbreak of civil war. King Charles sought to prove the divine right of kings through victory, while those against him sought to enforce varying degrees of constitutional change. In any case, England had not been involved in a major conflict for almost 60 years, since the time of the Spanish Armada. Some men might have served in their local militia, the trained bands. Fewer still would have fought in the 30 Years' War that had been raging on the continent. For the most part though, those joining up and their new leaders were complete novices. The little-known Huntingdon MP, Oliver Cromwell, a gentleman farmer, was one of many who had to convince men in his wide circle of friends and religious connections to join the fight for Parliament.
In many places there were fierce contests and disputes, almost to the blood, even at the first, for in the progress every county had more or less the civil war within itself.
In the late summer of 1642, Cromwell mustered a troop of horse in Cambridgeshire, and he had around 60 riders with him by early September. Now, as a captain, he was given an amount of money by Parliament, about £1,100. That was known as mounting money. And with it, he was responsible for providing his men with equipment, weapons, and of course, horses. Now, apparently the ideal number of hands for a horse, a military horse at the time, was 15 or 16. But Windsor here is 18-2, so a pretty big guy. Now, I don't have much riding experience, so I'm not sure if I'm actually going to survive this episode. We'll see.
Just in case I do survive though, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment. As I set off through the woods to join up with my fellow Roundhead volunteers, at least I was feeling well protected. Crucially, Parliament found itself in control of the key national armouries in Hull and London, a key advantage when it came to arming its supporters. The plan was to equip the vast majority of the Roundhead Cavalry, including Cromwell's, as harquebusiers. The term referenced an early type of long gun which could be used on horseback, the arquebus, but in essence it meant a lightly armoured cavalryman capable of using firearms and more conventional close quarters weapons.
So Cromwell's troopers would have been dressed a bit like this. They'd have had the very recognisable 3-bar pot, popular with both sides during the Civil War, which has this very recognisable lobster tail, these 3 vertical iron bars to stop sword cuts, although not much else. It'd have cheek plates and a brim, and they'd sometimes be painted in lamp black to prevent rust. Moving down, the only body armour worn by the harquebusier would have been a breast and a back plate. Now if you were smart, you'd have got your armour proofed when you bought it. That meant the armourer would point a pistol at it at close range, shoot at it, and if the ball bounced off, you'd pay full price. The only other bit of armour you might wear was a gauntlet on your left hand. This was your bridle hand, and a clever opponent would try and slash you here to try and make you lose control of your mount. But the real innovation in the 17th century was the buff coat or buff waistcoat. If your colonel was a bit stingy, you might only have a waistcoat with no arm protection, but this thickened leather could actually stop sword cuts. It wouldn't stop musket balls, obviously, but it was warmer, more comfortable, and more flexible than armour. Armour obviously going out of fashion during this period. And the buff coat, a good one, could cost more than all of your armour put together. Also very important were these thick leather riding boots. Both sides would charge in such close order that your knees would be touching those of the man next to you. And if you didn't have that padding, it was going to be quite painful. And finally, no uniforms in the English Civil War, so both sides wore these sashes or scarves. Now, Parliament chose orange. That was the colour of the Earl of Essex, one of their early commanders. And the royalists, just to make things really simple, chose red.
No wonder friendly fire incidents were all too common. With both sides fielding volunteer armies wearing similar equipment, new officers would have to find other ways of gaining an edge. It seems certain that many of them would have turned to the most popular military manuals of the time. John Crusoe's Military Instructions for the Cavalry was the go-to text, explaining the latest theories on training and tactics. The difficulty would be putting the theories into practice.
So Justin, I've turned up for my training in the Parliamentarian Cavalry. Presumably most guys that turned up for this kind of training would already know how to ride a horse, right?
They would have indeed, yes. They wouldn't have been expected to. Like modern cavalry, you're not expected to be able to ride. Back in the day, yes, they would have been able to expect to ride and even provide their own horse most of the time as well.
And what kind of training could they expect then above and beyond that? Presumably not much at the start of the war. They would need an action quite quickly, right?
Well, to be honest, yes, there wasn't much. It was very varied throughout the war. Due to the changing situation of the war meant that the privatisation, let's say, of some of the regiments meant that it was maybe a month, could be 3 months. It really depended on how the situation was developing and what facilities they had available. Some were pressed into service quite quickly.
It could have been much worse though. Men conscripted into the infantry received little training at all. In extreme cases, the time lapse between impressment and their first battle could be 3 days. You can see why officers found it easier to recruit for cavalry regiments throughout the war.
And how important was it that groups of horsemen were able to work as a unit? Presumably, like once they're kind of engaged with the enemy, there's not much a commander can do, right? They're almost lost. But at the start,
well, yes, they have to be well drilled, obviously. But my understanding that the parliamentarian forces, because they started to introduce standardisation in equipment, training, tactics, they were actually able to change manoeuvres sometimes during charges, which was the first time that had ever been done. Because up until that point, once you have a mass of horses and riders moving and underway, there's very little you can do then to change, to change direction or change what you want to do. And it also maximises the effect of a mass of horses onto a point in the battlefield. Obviously you want to keep everybody together. They're quite a force, an unstoppable force once they get going. And also for defence as well, the last thing you want to be is a rider on your own. If your enemy cavalry are nearby, you want there's safety in numbers. And also the horses as well work better together as a group. They are herd animals at the end of the day. They're not particularly aggressive, but if you have one or two horses that are what we call lead horses, they're braver than the others, let's say. As long as they're prepared to go forward into a battle environment that really a horse wouldn't normally go into. It's a frightening thing, isn't it? The rest will take confidence from that and will follow those lead horses in, and then once they're into the melee, that's job done then, isn't it?
I'm guessing the horses themselves, there would have been some attempt to acclimatise them to battle conditions, maybe firing off a musket near them, but
that's about all you can do.
Right, okay, so it's going to be quite unpredictable the first time you go into battle.
Yeah, you've got to, yes, there's an element of uncertainty there, yes, with your horse. Obviously, again, because you're in a group of horses and they're herd animals, they will follow each other, so, you've got an element of stability there, but yes, ultimately, there's not much you can do to train the horse apart from apart from firing cannons and guns and having the sword fights. But that doesn't replicate being in a battle with the commotion, the screaming, the shouting, the flags, the smoke, all that chaos.
Despite Hollywood depictions of cavalry charging each other at full tilt, in the 17th century it was advised to engage the enemy at a good trot, which isn't really that fast. Such was the desire to keep men and horses in good order on the approach.
And for the guys on the back of the horse, obviously, I think we're going to see in a minute, aren't we? The instability of riding a horse means that using your sword, using your pistols, whatever it is, it's not the same as being on the ground, is it?
No, it's very cumbersome. I mean, it's very cumbersome being on the ground. But yes, to ride a horse and be covered in this very thick armour, as you can see, I mean, this is best part of 5 mil thick, and it really doesn't bend at all. And the armour as well, you're very restricted in your movement, what you can do with a sword or a pistol, and even your head movement as well in your body to see opponents, see issues, see if your friend needs help. You're very restricted. I think in the early days they started off as cuirasses, which was like a full armoured knight, pretty much like the medieval times. But again, because that was expensive and very restricted, over the time of the war, they just reduced it. They took away the arms, they took away the legs, just left I've got the breastplate on, the breastplate like you, and slimmed down the helmet. So they had manoeuvrability over sheer armour.
Yeah, I mean, Cromwell's troops are mostly harquebusiers, right, wearing this kind of stuff. That's supposedly a light cavalry, but it's still pretty cumbersome, as you say. It's not that easy to move. The helmet gets stuck on the back, on your back plate.
You've noticed, have you? Yes, I did wonder whether it locks in place, doesn't it? And you're fighting that then. Never mind somebody bearing down on you, trying to put a sword through you.
The sash gets in the way. Yeah. It's not exactly practical, is it?
No, it's not at all. It's got to be easier than a knight. Back in the day,
yeah, for sure. And I guess the protection. The buff coat is quite good protection, isn't it? Particularly against sword cuts.
This will stop a sword. It obviously wouldn't stop a bullet, but yes, it will stop a sword. But as you move on through time, obviously all the armour eventually disappears, doesn't it, by the Napoleonic times? Because obviously firearms come into their own over time, and the armour really just gets in the way.
Not much point in it anymore. Okay, Justin. Well, I mean, these guys, they'd have to get some of their experience on the battlefield, but at least they could do a little bit of training. Can you show us some basic manoeuvres that they might have had to learn?
Yes, we can. We're going to do that now.
Let's head off.
All ready? Very good. Troop, single file to the right. March. Get single file to follow me. So when I say half sections in a minute, Louis, you've got to pull out to the left and pull up alongside Simon in front. Okay. Troop. Half sections. Then close the gap. Troop. Right wheel. March. Good, well done. And halt. Pressing. Come forward, Louis.
Can't quite get him to nudge over.
Come on.
The chief commanders, in their exercising of an infant troop, such a one as hath been newly raised, did customarily draw them forth by ranks, that they might place the best men and horse in the front, the second sort in the rear, and the third in the middle rank.
Troop, trot march.
The primary weapon for every cavalryman was his sword, but again, that's not to say that soldiers would receive any training in its use. Proficient gentlemen might prefer the more slender fencing rapier, best for thrusting at weak spots in armour. The unpractised amateur, like myself, would opt for a broadsword, best for wild hacking.
Now, one of the key challenges, of course, of being a cavalryman, that using your weapons, it's not very stable. You're sat on a horse. So one of the things that they train with is something like this. We're going to try and hit this cabbage with our swords. Wish us luck.
With one royalist vegetable taken care of, it was my turn to start chopping. Despite the enthusiasm of Parliament's mounted volunteers, when they first met the royalists in a major pitched battle, the results were rather embarrassing. As Prince Rupert's Cavaliers charged in, one troop of parliamentarian horse promptly defected. The rest fired their pistols and then immediately fled without even coming to blows. Had Rupert's men been able to surround the parliamentarian infantry and finish the job, rather than riding off to loot the baggage train, the war might have been over very quickly. As it turned out, neither side ended the day as outright winners.
So Cromwell was probably a witness to, or possibly arrived late at the Battle of Edgehill. We're not entirely sure what his involvement was, but we do know that he was deeply unimpressed by the performance of the parliamentarian cavalry, and he wrote to one of their commanders, "Your troops are most of them old decayed serving men and tapsters, and their troopers are gentlemen's sons and persons of quality. Do you think the spirits of such base and mean fellows will ever be able to encounter gentlemen that have honour and courage and resolution in them?" Clearly, he wasn't afraid of hurting people's feelings.
One of the problems was the parliamentarian strategy, which relied heavily on firearms to break up the enemy's formation. Cavalry troopers would fire at a distance or wait, often standing still for an incoming charge, then shoot at the last possible moment. Using unreliable flintlock carbines, a shortened musket about 2.5 feet in length, they'd need nerves of steel to keep their aim steady as the royalists, relying on the momentum of their charge, piled in with swords drawn. And once men and horses were entangled in the close press of battle, it was every man for himself.
Now, very useful for close quarters fighting with these pistols. You might have 2 or possibly even 3 of these on you in holsters. The advantage was that it was much shorter than the carbine, so you didn't have to use 2 hands to use it. The disadvantage was that it wasn't very accurate and it wasn't particularly powerful. You might have to actually be touching your opponent's armour, placing it against their helmet, for example, for it to kill them outright. And even then, it sometimes didn't work.
'Twas my fortune in a direct line to charge their general of horse. He discharged his carbine first, but at a distance not to hurt us, and afterwards one of his pistols. I then immediately struck into him and touched him before I discharged mine, and I'm sure I hit him, for he staggered and presently wheeled off from his party and ran. Follow him I did, and in 60 yards I came up to him and discharged the other pistol at him, and I'm sure I hit his head, for I touched it before I gave fire.
Even if they were wearing pistol-proof armour, mounted troops were in many ways more vulnerable than ever on the battlefield. Medical knowledge was still based on classical Greek theories, and while military surgery wasn't as hopeless as often assumed, even minor injuries might result in an amputated limb. Such was the risk of infection and gangrene. Artillery was now a major component of armies in the field, with masses of mounted soldiers making for easy targets. And new infantry tactics effectively combined cavalry action to the wings. The combination of pike and shot made head-on charges very dangerous indeed.
So James, I've infiltrated a royalist regiment just to see how the infantry would react to a cavalry charge, how you'd present a threat to people like me, the sort of parliamentarian horse. Can you show us what your group would do if a charge of horse was coming in? What kind of action you'd take? I assume it's quite advanced by this stage.
Absolutely. So for starters, while the cavalry were approaching, the musketeers, you can see before you, would be firing on the cavalry as they were coming in, either by salve, which is firing all the muskets together, or by firing in ranks, so we can maintain a constant rate of fire.
Okay.
And then as you follow across the company, the pikemen here have the 16-foot pikes tipped with steel and langettes to protect the pikes from being chopped off. They would charge the pikes for horse. So charge your pike for horse and draw your sword.
I see.
The pikes are aimed at the horse's chest height, because a horse is an intelligent animal. It's not going to ride into a division of pike.
That's a nasty array of spikes, isn't it? I assume this is quite uncomfortable for the pikemen down here.
Recover your pike to the order and put up your sword. The swords are drawn as well, so that if a rider is thrown, they can be dispatched quickly with the sword.
A direct attack might have seemed like certain suicide, but clever cavalry commanders could still get the better of infantry if they picked their moment. The flanks and rear of infantry formations were vulnerable, musketeers were slow to reload, and gaps in their fire could be exploited. And at the very least, you could make them run for cover.
Royal sword!
Okay, James, so this is our formation for the musketeers being protected against cavalry as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So the musketeers, as you can see, are safely protected behind all the pikes. All the pikemen there on the outside protecting the musketeers. Musketeers can fire out from this position as well.
Why don't they start in this position?
Because you can't move around as a division at all. The cavalry have effectively pinned down the infantry in this position. So as a tactical weapon, the cavalry have now stopped the infantry moving, and they are trapped in this position.
Got it. So it's kind of like an earlier Scottish Chiltern, right? I'm guessing a formation like this, once the cavalry have gone in, sort of vulnerable to artillery maybe in this position.
Artillery, and also the pistols that the cavalry carry, because they can quite happily sit at this range and fire the pistols into it.
Despite his inexperience, Oliver Cromwell quickly showed an innate understanding of how to play to his men's strengths. He was made a colonel in the spring of 1643, in charge of a regiment of horse, some 600 riders. At the Battle of Gainsborough in July, it was Cromwell's reserve who saved the day, when the royalist cavalry sprung a surprise attack. At Winsby in October, he used a feigned retreat to lure the royalists from a strong position, where they were wheeled on and cut down. He also had a horse shot from under him, but returned to lead his men to victory.
Cromwell inspired his men with personal acts of bravery, and he treated them well too. He'd make sure that they were paid on time and he'd listen to their concerns. But in return, he'd demand the highest standards of discipline. If you were caught swearing, you could be fined. If you were caught drunk, you'd be put in the stocks. If you abused one of your fellow soldiers, you could be dismissed. And if you were caught looting, you could be shot.
A few honest men are better than numbers. If you choose godly honest men to be captains of horse, honest men will follow them. I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else.
Come on, time for church.
So they may not have had as much fun as the royalists, but Cromwell's methods earned his soldiers a fearsome reputation. Having learned the lessons of Edgehill, his troopers were taught to wheel and reform after a successful engagement, not chase after a fleeing enemy. Many were also bonded by Puritanism, a somewhat humourless religious movement that sought to purify the church of all traces of Catholic ceremony, and encouraged a strict, moral lifestyle free from gambling, singing, and holidays. They were issued with individual pocket Bibles, just 16 pages in length, containing 150 rousing verse quotations picked by the colonel himself. The regiment's big moment came at Marston Moor in July 1644. With the light fading, Cromwell and Prince Rupert's cavalry would finally come face to face.
Ah, we've got a royalist cavalryman in our ranks, in our midst.
A handsome cavalier.
So John, at the start of the war, it's all going pretty well for the royalists, isn't it? They've got the star commander. Who's he?
So Prince Rupert, he is the king's nephew, and he was an experienced commander even in his 20s due to the 30 Years' War. So he had a lot of experience fighting on the continent and within the cavalry and using different cavalry tactics.
Yeah, to be fair, early on you were sort of giving us the runaround, weren't
They were,
you?
yes.
But using what tactics? What did the royalists do that was so effective?
So the royalists, using the tactics that Rupert had learned, preferred the charge. So he would fan his cavalry out wider and not as deep, and he would use the horse as a weapon and to gallop into the enemy as opposed to slowing down to fire weapons.
It was a bold strategy inspired by the methods of the Swedish king and general Gustavus Adolphus, who believed cavalry should be a light, fast and offensive weapon. By advancing in a formation 3 ranks deep rather than the usual 6, Rupert's men were able to envelop their enemies more easily.
I guess the parliamentarians must have caught on to that at some point and things began to change.
Discipline was the main reason for it. The parliamentarians, by the end of the war, learned to charge and then recover, where the royalists were very much a charge and then follow through, so they would chase the fleeing enemy too far. An example of this was at the Battle of Edgehill, where Rupert's cavalry notoriously ravaged the baggage train, and where at Naseby, Cromwell's parliament charged and then returned to support the infantry. The discipline was a war-changing.
Yeah, because they say at Edgehill, Rupert almost snatched a draw from the jaws of victory, didn't he? Like they could have blown the parliamentarians away early, but it was almost that reckless, bold nature that Rupert had that was an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time.
Yes. After Edgehill, Rupert wanted to march on London. He counselled the king to do this, and he was even happy to do it with the cavalry because the road was wide open. Other commanders decided against it, and it led to the war continuing.
And the royalist cavalry, do we know much about them, their training or anything like that? Was it any different to the parliamentarians, or were they all also volunteers, sort of dragged into the war sometimes against their will?
So it worked the same. They were given money from the king to raise regiments. Certain commanders were, and they would then sort of fund the regiments themselves by buying their own horses and paying the soldiers. A lot of the riders did come from the middle and upper classes due to riding experience. so generally the upper classes were happy to fight within the cavalry.
I see. John, I think I've been in cahoots with you for long enough. I'm going to go back to my men before they accuse me of conspiring with the royalists, and we'll see you on the battlefield.
We'll see you on the battlefield.
Darkness had almost fallen, and thunder rolled across the moor as a combined parliamentarian and Scottish army began its attack. The royalists were caught off guard, but with the battle underway, Rupert's army seemed to gain the upper hand.
Cromwell's own division had a hard pull of it, for they were charged by Rupert's bravest men in front and flank. They stood at the sword's point a pretty while, hacking one another, but at last he brake through them, scattering them before like a little dust. The left wing, which I commanded, being our own horse, saving a few Scots in our rear, beat all the prince's horse. God made them as stubble to our swords.
The training of Cromwell's men paid off. They halted as instructed after winning their cavalry duel and rode into the royalist infantry. Prince Rupert ended up hiding in a bean field to avoid capture, and Parliament effectively vanquished the King's forces from the north of England. But they still needed a crushing final victory to bring Charles to heel. In 1645, a radical reorganisation of the parliamentarian army was proposed to finally end the war. Soldiers would now need to serve as professionals wherever required, not just close to home. Officers would be chosen on merit and would not hold concurrent political posts. And the army would have a central command structure, with the proven General Sir Thomas Fairfax in charge.
The force that would become known as the New Model Army contained a massive contingent of 6,600 cavalrymen, divided into 11 regiments. Now that force was mostly made up of veterans from the 3 parliamentary regional forces, and they were all hardened by 3 years of civil war.
Cromwell was appointed Lieutenant General of Horse, second in command, just before the final showdown with King Charles. At the Battle of Naseby, the contrasting discipline of the royalist and parliamentarian cavalry proved decisive again. While Rupert's cavaliers were tempted once more by the baggage train, Cromwell's men reformed to break Charles's army. The royalist cause would outlive King Charles himself, who was beheaded in 1649. But the New Model Army went on to claim more stunning victories that would see Cromwell's star rise even further. While his men's behaviour in crushing an Irish rebellion would win them eternal infamy, the battles of Worcester and Dunbar proved that Cromwell's cavalry were among the best soldiers in Europe, and cemented a nickname that would stand the test of time: the Ironsides.
Cromwell and his Ironsides have taken on a notoriety, a kind of larger-than-life significance in British history. But a lot of that is due to what came later, when Cromwell was Lord Protector and in many ways a ruthless monarch himself. But what about the ordinary cavalry troopers who served in his regiment? Well, like many periods of history, the cavalry had it slightly better than the infantry. They were often volunteers rather than conscripts who were dragged into the army or the tenants of local gentry. They were slightly better paid, and they travelled in front of the main army, so they got the best billets. But leading from the front also meant they were much more likely to encounter the enemy, and many Civil War battles were just large cavalry skirmishes. As we've seen, the close quarters fighting could have been absolutely brutal. And there was also the trauma of fighting against people you knew. I mean, it was no cliche to say that family was pitted against family, friends against friends. In the end, around 60,000 soldiers are estimated to have died on the battlefield, perhaps 100,000 more from war-related diseases. But for anyone who fought in the Civil War and survived, it would have stayed with them for the rest of their life.
Thanks once again to the Worcestershire Cavalry and Marquess of Winchester's Regiment for making this episode possible. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment, and check out our other episodes, which are on the screen right now.
Fighting for old Charlie.